Welcome to Night Shift Pulse. Comment your city and the time below. The night connects us all. If you enjoy what you hear, please subscribe. Let's step into the dark. Story 1. The intake nurse assigned to a closed ward. I still remember the call I received. The woman said her name was Helen Garrett, administrative coordinator. She told me the state was finalizing asset liquidation for Whitmore Psychiatric Hospital and needed a registered nurse to assist with patient transfer inventory verification. The facility had been closed since 2009. I asked why they needed a nurse for paperwork. She said protocol required medical staff sign off on any documentation involving patient care, even retrospective audits. The pay was decent. 3 days of work, I agreed. I arrived on a Wednesday morning in late October. The building sat off Route 42, surrounded by fields that had gone to seed. The main structure was red brick, institutional and grim, with boarded windows and a chain-link fence marking the perimeter. A contractor met me at the gate. His name was Paul. He handed me a hard hat, a flashlight, and a key card that looked decades old. He said the power was functional in certain sections. He told me to stay in the administrative wing and avoid the patient floors. Structural concerns, he said. I nodded. The interior smelled like mildew and old paint. The hallways were wide, designed for gurneys and wheelchairs. Most of the furniture had been removed. I found the intake office on the ground floor near what used to be the main entrance. The door was unlocked. Inside, there were metal filing cabinets lining the walls, a desk covered in dust, and a corkboard with faded notices still pinned to it. I set my bag down and began sorting through the files. Most of them were standard. Admission forms, treatment plans, discharge summaries dated between 1997 and 2008. The handwriting varied. Different doctors, different nurses. I was supposed to cross-reference each file with a master log provided by the state to ensure no records had been misplaced during the closure. It was tedious work. I made notes. I drank coffee from a thermos. The room was cold. Around noon, I noticed something unusual. One of the filing cabinets in the corner had a clipboard hanging from a hook on its side. It was the kind nurses use for shift notes. The pages were yellowed but intact. I lifted it and flipped through. The top sheet was an admission log. It listed patient names, intake dates, attending physicians, and assigned wards. Standard format, but the dates were wrong. The first entry was marked November 14, 2010. That was a year after the hospital closed. I checked the next entry, January 3, 2011, then March 19, 2012. There were 12 entries in total, spanning 5 years. All of them recorded after Whitmore had been officially shut down. I assumed it was an error. Maybe someone had misfiled documents from another facility. I kept reading. The admissions were detailed. Each patient had a diagnosis: schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder with psychotic features. The attending physicians were listed by last name and employee number. Ward assignments were noted. Most were placed in C-Wing, which I knew from the floor plan had been the long-term psychiatric unit. I cross-referenced the employee numbers with the master log. None of them matched active personnel from the hospital's final operational years. What disturbed me was the signature at the bottom of each page. It was required for legal accountability. The intake nurse had to sign and date each admission. The signature was mine. Not similar, not close, identical. I compared it to the signature on my own employee badge. The loops, the slant, the spacing, exact. But the handwriting of the entries themselves was not mine. Someone else had filled out the forms. Someone else had processed these admissions. But my name was signed at the bottom. I put the clipboard down. My hands felt cold. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe another nurse shared my name. Maybe someone had forged signatures during the closure for bureaucratic reasons. I looked at the first entry again. The patient's name was Thomas Langford. Admission date November 14th, 2010. I walked to the filing cabinet and searched for his chart. It was there. The file was thick. Progress notes, medication logs, behavioral assessments. All of it dated after the hospital closed. The notes described a man in his 50s, nonverbal, prone to dissociative episodes. He had been placed in room C12. I flipped to the last page. There was no discharge summary. The file simply stopped in March of 2015. I checked the other names on the clipboard. I found files for all of them, every single one. They were stored in chronological order, as if someone had been maintaining active records years after the evacuation. The notes were clinical, precise, and routine. They described medication schedules, therapy sessions, and incident reports. One patient had attempted self-harm. Another had refused meals for 6 days. The language was calm, procedural. It read like the work of trained staff documenting ongoing care. I stepped out of the office. The hallway was silent. I walked to the stairwell and climbed to the second floor. C-Wing was at the far end. The door was locked, but the key card Paul had given me worked. The ward was dark. I used my flashlight. The patient rooms were small, each with a narrow bed frame and a barred window. Most of the rooms were empty. I found room C12. The door was ajar. Inside, the walls were bare. No furniture, no evidence anyone had been there. But on the floor near the window, there was a hospital bracelet. It was faded, but I could still read the name. Thomas Langford. Admission date November 14th, 2010. I went back downstairs. I sat at the desk in the intake office and stared at the clipboard. I tried to think of rational explanations. Maybe the records were part of a training exercise. Maybe the hospital had been used for simulations after closure. But that did not explain the signatures. It did not explain the files. I looked at the last entry on the clipboard. It was dated June 9th, 2015. The patient's name was Claire Dennison. She had been admitted for acute psychosis. The attending physician was listed as Dr. Paul Millard. I searched for her file. It was there. The last progress note was dated 2 weeks after her admission. It described her as stable, cooperative, responding well to medication. There was no discharge date. The file just ended. I heard a sound in the hallway. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. I stood and walked to the door. The hallway was empty. I waited. The sound stopped. I returned to the desk. I checked my phone. No signal. I had been in the building for over 6 hours. I gathered my things. I locked the intake office and walked toward the exit. As I passed the main stairwell, I glanced up. There was a figure standing on the second floor landing. I could not make out details. Just a silhouette. I called out. No response. The figure turned and walked out of sight. I left the building. Paul was waiting by the gate. I asked him if anyone else had been inside. He said no. I asked him if the hospital had been used for anything after closure. He said the building had been vacant since evacuation. No training programs. No contractors until this week. I did not mention the clipboard. I got in my car and drove home. The next morning, I received another call from Helen Garrett. She thanked me for my work and said they no longer needed my assistance. The audit had been completed by another team. I asked her who had signed off on the intake records. She paused. She said there were no intake records. The hospital had been closed for over a decade. All patient documentation had been transferred to the State Archive in 2009. I told her I had found active admissions dated years after closure. She said that was impossible. She thanked me again and ended the call. I tried to follow up. I called the state health department. I requested access to the archive. I was told there was no record of a Helen Garrett working in hospital administration. I was told Whitmore Psychiatric Hospital had been fully decommissioned and its records sealed pending litigation. I was told no personnel had been granted access to the building in the past month. I asked about the audit. They said there was no audit. I still have the photograph I took of the clipboard before I left. I look at it sometimes. My signature is there, clear and unmistakable, certifying admissions that occurred in a building that had been empty for years. I do not know who those patients were. I do not know who processed their intake, but I know one thing. My name was on every page. And somewhere in that silence, someone had been keeping records long after everyone else had gone. Story 2. The Psychiatric Records Officer and the Missing Discharge Dates. The assignment came through the Office of Mental Health Services in late September. I had been working as a records officer for 11 years, mostly digitizing archived patient files for state facilities transitioning to electronic systems. The project at Harrington State Psychiatric Hospital was supposed to be straightforward. The building was scheduled for demolition in January. My job was to scan and index all remaining patient charts before the site was cleared. I was given an estimated timeline of 8 weeks. I was the only staff member assigned. I arrived on the first Monday of October. The hospital had been closed since 2007. It was a large facility originally built in the 1920s with multiple wings and over 400 patient beds at its peak. By the time of closure, the census had dropped to fewer than 80 residents, most of whom were transferred to community care programs or other state hospitals. The building had been left largely intact. Medical equipment, furniture, and records remained in place, untouched for over a decade. I was given access to the medical records department located on the ground floor of the administrative wing. The room was vast, lined with floor-to-ceiling shelving units filled with patient charts. Each chart was labeled with a patient name, admission date, and medical record number. My task was to scan every document, upload it to a secure database, and verify that the digital copy matched the original. It was meticulous work, but I was used to it. I set up my portable scanner, laptop, and filing system and began. The first week proceeded without incident. Most of the charts I reviewed followed predictable patterns: admission paperwork, diagnostic evaluations, treatment plans, progress notes documenting medication adjustments, therapy sessions, and behavioral observations. Discharge summaries, when present, were typically brief. They noted the date of discharge, the reason, usually transfer to another facility or release to family care, and the condition of the patient at the time of departure. Many files ended abruptly in late 2007, consistent with the hospital's emergency closure following budget cuts and regulatory violations. By the end of the second week, I began noticing inconsistencies. A small number of files, perhaps 1 in every 30, contained progress notes that extended beyond the closure date. At first, I assumed these were misfiled documents from other institutions accidentally mixed in during the evacuation. But the notes referenced Harrington by name. They described treatments administered in specific wards I knew were part of this building. The entries were dated in 2008, 2009, and in some cases as recently as 2012. One file in particular stood out. The patient's name was Daniel Reuben Moss. He had been admitted in June of 2003 for treatment-resistant schizophrenia. His chart was thick, over 300 pages, documenting years of hospitalizations, medication trials, and behavioral incidents. The last entry I expected to find was a discharge summary dated October of 2007, the month the hospital officially closed. Instead, the file continued. Progress notes appeared monthly through 2008. They described routine check-ins, unchanged medication regimens, and stable behavior. The notes were signed by Dr. Evelyn Marlowe, a psychiatrist whose name appeared frequently in other charts from the same period. I cross-referenced her employment record with the state database. Dr. Marlowe had resigned in August of 2007. She had not worked at Harrington after closure. I continued scanning files. The pattern repeated. Approximately 15% of the charts I reviewed contained treatment notes extending into years the hospital was not operational. The notes were detailed and consistent with standard psychiatric documentation. They included patient complaints, observed symptoms, staff interventions, and clinical impressions. They read like the work of professionals engaged in active care. But there were no discharge dates. The files simply continued week after week, month after month, until they abruptly stopped. No explanation, no transfer documentation, no notation of death or closure. I brought the discrepancy to the attention of my supervisor. I sent her scanned copies of several files and asked if similar documentation errors had been found at other decommissioned facilities. She responded the following day. She said the records were likely carryover notes from discharge planning backdated for legal continuity. She instructed me to flag any files with post-closure entries but to continue scanning without delay. She reminded me that the demolition schedule was fixed and that the project could not be extended. I returned to the records room. As I worked through the next set of shelves, I noticed something else. My employee identification number appeared in several of the progress notes. It was listed under the field for attending staff. At first, I thought it was a scanning error, a digital artifact from the upload process. But when I checked the original paper documents, the number was there, handwritten in blue ink. My ID number had been issued to me in 2013, 6 years after Harrington closed. It should not have existed in any document from this facility. I searched for my name in the database. I found 3 files where I was listed as the primary records officer responsible for chart updates. The entries were dated 2014 and 2015. I was working at a different facility during that time. I had never been to Harrington before this assignment. I had no memory of processing these files. Yet the notes indicated I had personally reviewed the patient's treatment plans, verified medication orders, and signed off on continued care. The signatures were not mine. They were close, but the handwriting was slightly different, more hurried and less legible than my own. I began pulling files at random. I found my employee number in over 40 charts. In some, I was listed as a consulting officer. In others, I was noted as having conducted file audits or provided administrative oversight. The entries spanned a 5-year period from 2010 to 2015. All of them described my involvement in ongoing patient care at a hospital that had been closed since 2007. I took photographs of the pages with my phone. I wanted evidence. I wanted proof that I was not imagining this. That evening, I stayed late in the records room. I decided to trace one patient's file from admission to the last documented note. The patient's name was Rebecca Holt. She had been admitted in 1998 for bipolar disorder with manic episodes. Her chart was over 500 pages. I scanned every entry. Her treatment history was well documented. Hospitalizations, relapses, stabilizations. Her last admission to Harrington was in March of 2006. She was discharged in September of that year to a supervised group home. That should have been the end of her file, but it was not. Progress notes resumed in January of 2008. They described her readmission for acute mania. The notes detailed her placement in Ward B, her response to lithium therapy, and her participation in group counseling. The attending physician was Dr. Marlowe. The notes continued monthly until June of 2011 when they stopped without explanation. I looked up Rebecca Holt in the state mental health registry. She was listed as deceased. Date of death, November 2006. Cause of death, accidental overdose. She had died 2 years before the notes in her Harrington file claimed she was readmitted. I cross-referenced the other files where my employee number appeared. I found similar discrepancies. Patients documented as deceased, transferred, or released, yet their charts continued to record active treatment years later. The notes described routine care, medication administration, therapy attendance, behavioral observations, all of it written as if the patients were still present, still receiving services in a facility that no longer existed. I heard a sound from the hallway. It was late, past 9 in the evening. I was alone in the building. The security contractor had left hours earlier. I walked to the door and looked out. The hallway was dark. The overhead lights in the records room cast a narrow beam through the doorway. I saw nothing. I closed the door and returned to the files. I decided to check the employee database. I searched for the names of the staff members who had signed the post-closure progress notes. Dr. Evelyn Marlowe, Nurse Janet Kowalski, Therapist Raymond Kemp, Social worker Linda Pryor. All of them had worked at Harrington before 2007. All of them had left the facility prior to closure. I found their resignation letters in the personnel files. None of them had returned. None of them had worked in any state facility after leaving Harrington. Yet their signatures appeared in charts documenting patient care years after the hospital closed. Their employee ID numbers were listed. Their clinical notes were detailed, competent, and consistent with their documented areas of expertise. I pulled my own personnel file from the administrative cabinet. It was thin. Employment start date, job title, certification number, standard information. But at the bottom of the file there was a transfer notice. It was dated August of 2010. It stated that I had been reassigned from my previous position to Harrington State Psychiatric Hospital, effective immediately, to serve as the primary records officer for ongoing patient documentation. I had never seen this notice before. I had never been reassigned to Harrington. I had been working at a facility in the northern part of the state in 2010. I had tax records, pay stubs, performance reviews. All of it placed me 300 miles away from this building. I took the transfer notice with me. I left the records room and walked through the hallways. I wanted to see the patient wards. I climbed the stairs to the second floor. Ward B was at the end of the corridor. The door was locked, but the key I had been given worked. Inside, the ward was silent. Patient rooms lined both sides of a central hallway. I walked slowly, checking each room. Most were empty. Bed frames had been removed. Windows were sealed. But in room B14, I found something. A patient chart was lying on the floor near the window. It was open. The name on the chart was Rebecca Holt. The last entry was dated June 9, 2011. The note described her as stable, cooperative, and ready for discharge pending family approval. There was no discharge date. The file simply ended. I returned to the records room and continued scanning. I worked through the night. I processed over 200 files. By dawn, I had documented 73 charts with post-closure treatment notes. In 46 of those files, my employee ID number appeared. I compiled a report. I listed the names of the patients, the dates of the discrepant entries, and the staff members who had signed the notes. I emailed the report to my supervisor and requested an immediate review. I asked for clarification on the transfer notice I had found in my personnel file. I asked if there had been any covert operations at Harrington after closure. I received an automated reply. My supervisor was out of the office. I did not return to Harrington the following week. I called the Office of Mental Health Services and requested a meeting with the director. I was told the project had been suspended. The demolition had been moved up. The building was being cleared immediately. I asked if anyone would review the files I had flagged. I was told the records had been transferred to a secure archive and would be assessed by an external auditor. I asked if I could access the archive. I was told access was restricted pending litigation. I never received a response to my report. I never learned what happened to the 73 patients whose charts documented years of care in a hospital that had been closed. I do not know who wrote those notes. I do not know why my employee ID number appeared in files from years I was working elsewhere. But I do know this. The records were meticulous, the care described was real, and somewhere in those empty wards someone had been keeping detailed documentation long after the lights went out and the doors were locked for the last time. Story 3. The night security medic who responded to an internal code. I was contracted through a private security firm in early November. The assignment was short-term, 5 nights total, providing emergency medical coverage during overnight safety inspections at Ridgewood Psychiatric Hospital. The building had been closed since 2008. A development company had purchased the property and planned to convert it into luxury condominiums. Before renovations could begin, the structure required a full safety assessment. The inspection team worked during the day. I was there in case someone got injured after hours. My shifts ran from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning. I arrived on my first night and met the site supervisor, a man named Gerald Brennan. He gave me a brief orientation. The building had no active utilities except for emergency lighting powered by a backup generator. The inspection team had set up a command post in the main lobby. I was assigned a small office near the entrance to use as a medical station. Gerald handed me a 2-way radio, a flashlight, a site map, and a clipboard with incident report forms. He told me the building was structurally sound but warned me to stay out of the patient wards unless called. He said most of the team would be gone by 8. I would be alone for most of the night. I told him I was comfortable with that. I had worked similar contracts before. The first 3 nights were uneventful. I stayed in my office, read a book, and monitored the radio. Occasionally, one of the remaining crew members would check in. The building was silent. The only sounds were the hum of the generator and the wind outside. I walked the perimeter once each night to stay alert. The hallways were long and institutional, lined with faded paint and abandoned furniture. I saw no one. On the 4th night, things changed. I arrived at 10 as usual. Gerald was not there. Another supervisor, a younger man named Carl, met me instead. He said Gerald had called in sick. Carl seemed nervous. He told me the inspection had been delayed due to equipment failure. Most of the crew had left early. Only 2 technicians remained working on the 3rd floor. He said they would be finished by midnight. I asked if I should wait until they were done. He said no. He said I was required to stay until 6 regardless. He handed me the radio and left. I sat up in the medical office and waited. The building felt different that night. The air was colder. The emergency lights seemed dimmer. I checked my equipment, trauma kit, oxygen, AED, basic medications. Everything was in order. I turned on the radio and listened. Static. I adjusted the frequency, still static. I assumed the signal was weak inside the building. I walked to the lobby and tried again. The static cleared. I heard voices. 2 men, the technicians on the 3rd floor, discussing ventilation shaft measurements. I returned to the office. At 11:43, the radio crackled. A voice came through, calm and professional. Code Gray, West Wing, room 217, patient unresponsive, requesting immediate medical. I grabbed my kit and responded. I identified myself and asked for clarification. The voice repeated. Code Gray, West Wing, room 217, patient unresponsive. I asked who was calling. No response, just static. I checked the site map. The West Wing was part of the old acute care unit. It was on the second floor at the far end of the building. I had not been there before. I radioed the technicians on the third floor. No answer. I tried calling Carl. No answer. I hesitated. A Code Gray was a medical emergency involving a patient or staff member in distress. But there were no patients. The hospital had been closed for over a decade. I assumed it was a drill or a miscommunication. But the voice had been specific. Room 217. I decided to check. I left the office and walked through the main corridor toward the West Wing. The emergency lights flickered. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness. The hallways were narrow here, designed for patient transport. I passed empty nurses' stations, medication rooms, and locked storage closets. The air smelled of mildew and old disinfectant. I reached the stairwell and climbed to the second floor. The West Wing was darker than the rest of the building. The emergency lights were out. I used my flashlight. The patient rooms were arranged along both sides of a central hallway. Each door had a small window and a room number placard. I walked slowly, checking the numbers. Room 215, room 216, room 217. The door was closed. I knocked. No response. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. I pushed the door open. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 12. There was a bed frame against the wall, stripped of its mattress. A barred window overlooked the rear courtyard. No furniture, no equipment, no one inside. I stepped in and looked around. On the floor near the bed there was a hospital gown. It was folded neatly, as if someone had placed it there intentionally. I picked it up. It was damp and cold. I set it down and stepped back into the hallway. The radio crackled again, the same voice. Vitals recorded. Heart rate 42, blood pressure 80/50, respiratory rate 8, patient bradycardic and hypotensive, awaiting intervention. I responded immediately. I said I was in room 217. I said the room was empty. I asked who was transmitting. No response, just static. I walked back down the hallway. I tried the technicians again. No answer. I tried Carl. No answer. I checked my phone. No signal. I felt uneasy. I returned to the medical office and reviewed the radio log on my clipboard. There was no record of a Code Gray. No incident had been called. I checked the frequency on the radio. It was set correctly. I replayed the transmissions in my mind. The voice had been calm, clinical, precise. It had used medical terminology. Heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate. Whoever was speaking knew what they were doing. At 12:21, the radio crackled again. A different voice this time, female, equally calm. Patient stabilized, vitals improving. Heart rate 58, blood pressure 90/60, respiratory rate 12. Continuing observation. I asked who was speaking. No response. I asked for a location. No response. I grabbed my kit and walked back to the West Wing. Room 217 was exactly as I had left it, empty. I checked the adjacent rooms, all empty. I walked the entire hallway, nothing. I returned to the stairwell and climbed to the third floor. The technicians were gone. Their equipment was packed up. The floor was silent. I descended to the ground floor and checked the lobby. No one. I was alone. I returned to the medical office and sat down. I reviewed the radio frequencies. I switched to the alternate channel. Static. I switched back. Clear signal. I waited. At 1:04, the radio crackled again. The male voice returned. Patient discharge paperwork completed. Transfer scheduled for 0600 hours. All vitals stable. No further intervention required. I did not respond. I turned the radio off. I spent the rest of the night in the office. I did not walk the building again. At 6 in the morning, Carl returned. He asked if the night had been quiet. I told him about the radio transmissions. He looked at me strangely. He said there were no other personnel in the building overnight. He said the technicians had left at 10:30. He said the radios were short range and only worked within the building. He said no one else had access to the frequency. I showed him my notes. He read them. He said it was probably interference from a nearby emergency channel. He thanked me for my time and said my contract was complete. I left the building and drove home. I tried to rationalize what I had heard. Crossed signals, old equipment. Maybe someone from a nearby hospital had transmitted on the same frequency, but the transmissions had been specific. Room 217, West Wing. Vitals called out with clinical precision. And the timing. The voice had called for medical intervention exactly when I arrived at the room. It had announced discharge exactly when my shift was ending. I contacted the security firm the following week. I requested copies of the radio logs from that night. They said no logs were kept. I asked if other medics had reported similar incidents. They said I was the only medic contracted for that assignment. I asked if Ridgewood had a history of emergency calls during its operational years. They said patient records were sealed. I searched public records. I found incident reports from Ridgewood's final years of operation. Multiple code grays, multiple unresponsive patients. Room 217 was listed in several reports. One patient had died there in 2006. Cardiac arrest. Another had been found unresponsive in 2007. Overdose. Both incidents had required emergency intervention. Both had been called over the radio by nursing staff. The language in the reports matched the transmissions I had heard. Heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate. Clinical, calm, precise. I do not know who was transmitting that night. I do not know why the calls originated from a room that had been empty for over a decade. But I know this. Someone was monitoring vitals. Someone was documenting interventions. And somewhere in that silent building, someone was still calling for help long after the patients had gone. Story 4. The Rehabilitation Therapist and the Treatment Wing Map. I was hired in mid-November by a consulting group retained by a non-profit organization. They had acquired the former Belmont Psychiatric Hospital and were exploring its potential conversion into a rehabilitation and recovery center for addiction treatment. The building had been abandoned since 2006. My role was to conduct a preliminary assessment of the facility's existing therapy and treatment spaces, evaluate their suitability for adaptation, and provide recommendations for renovation. I was given 2 weeks to complete the evaluation. I worked alone. I arrived on a cold Monday morning. The hospital was located on a rural property surrounded by dense woods. The main building was 4 stories, constructed in the 1950s with wings extending from a central administrative core. I was met by a representative from the non-profit, a woman named Laura Winters. She provided me with blueprints, a key set, and a safety briefing. She said the building was structurally sound, but cautioned me to avoid upper floors until they had been inspected by engineers. She left after an hour. I was alone for the rest of the day. I started with the ground floor. The layout matched the blueprints. Administrative offices, a cafeteria, a small library, and a recreation room. Most of the furniture had been removed. The walls were faded but intact. I took measurements, photographed the spaces, and made notes on potential uses. The cafeteria could serve as a dining hall. The recreation room could be converted into a group therapy space. The work was straightforward. On the second day, I explored the second floor. This level had housed the primary treatment areas during the hospital's operational years. I found several large rooms labeled as therapy rooms on the blueprints. They were empty but well preserved. High ceilings, large windows, decent natural light. I noted that minor cosmetic updates would make them suitable for counseling and rehabilitation sessions. As I walked the hallway, I noticed a door near the east stairwell that was not marked on the blueprints. It was partially obscured by peeling wallpaper. I tried the handle. It was locked. I checked my key set. None of the keys worked. I marked the location on my map and continued. On the third day, I decided to examine the third floor despite Laura's caution. I wanted a complete picture of the building. The third floor had been used for long-term residential care. The layout was different from the lower levels. Instead of large open rooms, there were smaller individual units arranged along a central corridor. Each unit had a bed, a desk, and a private bathroom. I noted that these could be adapted into resident housing for extended treatment programs. As I walked the corridor, I found another door not marked on the blueprints. It was located at the end of the hallway, identical to the one I had found on the second floor. Locked, no keys worked. I marked it and moved on. That evening, I reviewed the blueprints in my temporary office on the ground floor. I compared them to the layout I had observed. The two unmarked doors were not included. I searched the architectural plans more carefully. There were no notations indicating sealed-off areas, storage closets, or restricted zones in those locations. The spaces simply did not exist on paper. I assumed they were later additions, perhaps installed during renovation projects that had not been documented. I made a note to ask Laura about them. On the fourth day, I returned to the second floor with a flashlight and a pry bar. I wanted to see what was behind the unmarked door. I worked carefully, loosening the frame without causing significant damage. After 20 minutes, the door opened. Inside was a narrow staircase leading downward. It was not a typical stairwell. The steps were steep, the ceiling low, and the walls unfinished concrete. I descended slowly. At the bottom, I found another door. This one was unlocked. I pushed it open. I stepped into a hallway I had not seen before. It was wide, well lit by overhead fluorescent fixtures that still functioned, and lined with doors on both sides. Each door had a small placard with a room number and a designation. Therapy Room A, Therapy Room B, Counseling Suite 1, Counseling Suite 2, Group Session Hall. The hallway extended at least 50 feet before turning. I checked my map. This space did not exist on the blueprints. I walked slowly, opening each door. The rooms were furnished, chairs arranged in circles, desks with patient intake forms stacked neatly, whiteboards with session schedules written in faded marker. The dates on the schedules were recent: October 2014, November 2015. The hospital had closed in 2006. I continued down the hallway. The turn led to another corridor, identical in layout. More therapy rooms, more counseling suites. I opened a door labeled Group Session Hall. Inside was a large room with tiered seating, a podium, and a projection screen. On the whiteboard at the front, a schedule was written in blue marker. Weekly sessions, Monday through Friday. 10 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 7 in the evening. At the bottom of the schedule, under the heading Lead Provider, my name was written: Dr. Adrian Cole. My credentials. My license number. I had never worked at Belmont. I had never been to this building before this assignment. I had never led group sessions in a psychiatric hospital. My specialty was outpatient rehabilitation and community-based recovery programs. I did not understand why my name was on the board. I took a photograph with my phone. The lighting was poor, but the image was clear enough. I left the room and continued exploring. I found an office at the end of the hallway. The door was open. Inside, there was a desk, a filing cabinet, and a bookshelf filled with clinical manuals. On the desk was a nameplate: Dr. Adrian Cole, lead rehabilitation therapist. I opened the filing cabinet. It was filled with patient files. Each file contained intake forms, treatment plans, progress notes, and session summaries. The files were organized by year, 2010 through 2016. I pulled one at random. The patient's name was Michael Gregory Foster. He had been admitted in April of 2013 for opioid addiction and major depressive disorder. The treatment plan was detailed: individual counseling twice weekly, group therapy 3 times weekly. Medication management. The notes described his progress over 18 months. He had responded well to treatment. He had completed the program in September of 2014. The discharge summary was signed by me, Dr. Adrian Cole. I checked another file. A patient named Jennifer Elaine Morse, admitted in June of 2011 for alcohol dependence and anxiety disorder. Treatment plan identical in structure. Progress notes spanning 2 years. Discharge summary signed by me. I pulled 10 more files. All of them listed me as the lead therapist. All of them documented treatment provided in this building, in these rooms, years after Belmont had closed. The notes were thorough, professional, and consistent with standard clinical practice. They described sessions I had no memory of conducting, patients I had never met. I left the office and walked back through the hallways. I climbed the hidden staircase and returned to the 2nd floor. The unmarked door was still ajar. I closed it and walked to my temporary office. I called Laura. No answer. I left a message asking her to call me back as soon as possible. I spent the rest of the day reviewing the blueprints, comparing them to the spaces I had found. There was no logical way the treatment wing I had discovered could fit within the building's footprint. The hallways extended too far. The rooms were too numerous. They should have intersected with the exterior walls, but they did not. The structure did not make sense. On the 5th day, Laura returned my call. I told her what I had found. She was silent for a long time. She asked me to describe the rooms in detail. I did. She said there was no record of any treatment wing in that configuration. She said the building had been fully surveyed prior to purchase. She said the blueprints were comprehensive. She asked if I had taken photographs. I said yes. She asked me to send them to her. I did. She called me back an hour later. She said the photographs showed rooms that did not appear in any architectural documentation. She said the nonprofit was suspending the project pending further investigation. She said my contract was terminated effective immediately. She thanked me for my work. I returned to the building one last time to collect my equipment. I descended the hidden staircase again. The hallways were as I had left them. I walked to the office with my nameplate. I opened the filing cabinet and took one of the patient files with me. I wanted proof. I climbed back upstairs and left the building. I reviewed the file at home. The patient's name was David Allen Grant. He had been admitted in January of 2012 for methamphetamine addiction. The progress notes described sessions led by me: cognitive behavioral therapy, relapse prevention, family counseling. The notes spanned 3 years. The final entry was dated March of 2015. It stated that David had completed treatment successfully and was discharged to outpatient care. The note was signed in my handwriting. I searched for David Allen Grant in public records. I found an obituary. He had died in October of 2011. Cause of death: overdose. He had died 3 months before the file claimed he had been admitted to Belmont. I checked the other names I had photographed from the filing cabinet. 4 of them were listed as deceased prior to their documented admission dates. 2 had no records at all. They did not appear in any state database. It was as if they had never existed. I contacted the licensing board for my state. I requested a review of my employment history. They confirmed I had never been affiliated with Belmont Psychiatric Hospital. I had never held a position as a lead rehabilitation therapist in any institutional setting. My entire career had been in outpatient clinics and community programs. I asked if there had been any complaints or inquiries related to my license. They said no. My record was clear. I do not know what those rooms were. I do not know why my name was written on the schedules, the nameplate, and the discharge summaries, but I know this. Someone had been conducting therapy sessions in a building that had been closed for years. Someone had been documenting treatment for patients who were already dead. And somewhere in those hidden hallways, my name had been assigned to work I had never done, in a place I had never been for people who had never existed. Story 5. The medical examiner who cataloged the vacant morgue. I received the assignment in early December. The Department of Public Health had contracted my office to conduct a final inspection of the morgue at Eastbrook Psychiatric Hospital prior to demolition. The facility had been closed since 2009. My responsibility was to verify that no human remains, biological material, or improperly disposed medical waste had been left behind. It was a routine procedure. I had performed similar inspections at decommissioned hospitals, nursing homes, and correctional facilities. I expected the task to take no more than 2 days. I arrived on a Thursday morning. The hospital was located on the outskirts of the county, surrounded by overgrown fields and access roads that had fallen into disrepair. The main building was 5 stories, institutional brick with narrow windows and a flat roof. I was met by a county official named Thomas Harding. He provided me with access codes, a security escort, and a layout of the morgue's location. The morgue was in the basement, accessible via a service elevator near the loading dock. Thomas told me the power had been restored temporarily for the inspection. He said I would be alone in the building. He left shortly after my arrival. I descended to the basement level. The service elevator opened into a narrow hallway lined with storage rooms and mechanical equipment. The morgue was at the far end. The door was marked with faded lettering, pathology and morgue services. I used the access code. The door unlocked with a heavy click. I stepped inside. The morgue was larger than I had anticipated. The main room contained a central examination table, a sink, storage cabinets, and a wall of refrigeration units designed for body storage. There were 12 units in total, arranged in 2 rows of 6. Each unit had a stainless steel door with a handle and a small identification slot for labeling. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant, though it had been years since the space had been in use. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly. I set my equipment down and began the inspection. I started with the examination table. It was clean, free of biological residue. I checked the sink and drainage system. No blockages, no evidence of improper disposal. I inspected the cabinets. Most were empty. A few contained outdated medical supplies, gloves, syringes, specimen containers. I documented everything with photographs and notes. I moved to the refrigeration units. I opened the first door. The unit was empty. I checked the second. Also empty. I continued down the row. All of the units were vacant, as expected. The hospital had been evacuated over a decade ago. All remains had been transferred to the county morgue or released to families during the closure process. I reached the final unit on the bottom row. I pulled the handle. The door opened. Inside, lying on the metal tray, was a toe tag. It was the only item in any of the units. A standard identification tag, the kind used to label bodies in morgue storage. It was made of heavy paper stock with a wire loop for attachment. I picked it up. The tag was filled out in black ink. Name, date of admission, identification number, and cause of death. The name on the tag was mine. Dr. Samuel Howard Brennan. The identification number matched my medical examiner license issued to me in 2013. The date of admission was listed as December 19, 2015. That was 8 days from the current date. The cause of death was listed as unspecified cardiac event. I stood there for several minutes holding the tag. I checked the unit again. There was no body, just the tag, resting on the empty tray. I examined it closely. The handwriting was neat, precise, and professional. The information was accurate. My full name, my license number, even my date of birth, which was not commonly known outside of official records. I took photographs of the tag from multiple angles. I placed it in an evidence bag and sealed it. I left the morgue and walked through the basement hallways. I wanted to check the administrative records to see if there was any documentation explaining the tag's presence. I found the pathology office near the morgue entrance. The door was unlocked. Inside, there were filing cabinets, a desk, and shelves lined with binders. I searched the cabinets. Most contained patient autopsy reports and death certificates from the hospital's operational years. I found a binder labeled Morgue Inventory Logs. I opened it. The logs documented every body received, stored, and released from the morgue between 1998 and 2009. The entries were organized chronologically. Each entry included the decedent's name, date of death, identification number, storage unit assignment, and release information. I flipped to the final entries dated in late 2009, consistent with the hospital's closure. Then I turned the page. The log continued. There were entries dated 2010, 2011, and as recently as 2016. The entries followed the same format: name, date of death, identification number, storage unit assignment. But there were no release dates. The bodies were logged as received and stored, but never transferred or released. I counted 47 entries spanning 7 years. I cross-referenced the identification numbers with my state database using my phone. 32 of the individuals listed were confirmed deceased with official death certificates filed in other jurisdictions. Their dates of death in the official records did not match the dates in the morgue log. In most cases, the individuals had died years before the dates listed in the Eastbrook entries. I found my name in the log. It was the final entry, dated December 19, 2015. The same date listed on the toe tag. The entry noted my identification number, my name, and my cause of death. Storage Unit 12, the unit where I had found the tag. I took photographs of every page. I returned to the morgue. I stood in front of Unit 12. I opened the door again. The tag was gone. I had sealed it in an evidence bag. I had placed the bag on the examination table. I walked over. The bag was there, still sealed. But when I looked inside, the tag was blank. The ink was gone. The paper was clean, as if it had never been written on. I opened the bag and examined the tag under the light. No impressions, no residue, nothing. I heard a sound behind me. A faint mechanical hum. I turned. The refrigeration units were activating. One by one, the compressors engaged. The hum grew louder. I walked to the control panel on the wall. The power switches were in the off position. I checked the circuit breaker. It was also off. But the units were running. I could feel the cold air beginning to circulate. I opened the first unit. The interior was frosting over. I closed it and opened the second. The same. I moved down the row. Every unit was cooling, despite the disconnected power. I left the morgue and climbed the stairs to the ground floor. I called Thomas Harding. No answer. I called my office. I spoke with my supervisor and described what I had found. She was silent for a long time. She asked if I had removed anything from the site. I told her about the toe tag. She asked me to return to the office immediately and bring all documentation. She said the inspection was suspended. She said she would contact the county. I returned to the basement to collect my equipment. The morgue door was closed. I entered the access code. The door did not open. I tried again. The code was rejected. I tried the manual override. The door remained locked. I walked back to the service elevator. It was not responding. I took the stairs to the loading dock. The exit door was locked from the inside. I searched for another exit. I found a side door near the mechanical room. It opened. I left the building. I reviewed the photographs that evening. The toe tag images were clear. My name, my identification number, the date 8 days in the future. I enlarged the image to examine the handwriting. It was identical to the handwriting in the morgue logs. Neat, clinical, professional. I searched the state medical examiner database for any records associated with my name and license number. I found my active license, my employment history, and my case files. Nothing unusual. I searched for death records. There was none. I was alive, documented, and accounted for. The following week, I received a letter from the Department of Public Health. It stated that the Eastbrook inspection had been completed by another examiner. The site had been cleared for demolition. No human remains or biological material had been found. The morgue had been certified as vacant. I called the department and asked to speak with the examiner who had completed the work. I was told the information was confidential. I requested a copy of the final inspection report. I was told it was not available for release. I searched public records for information on Eastbrook's morgue operations. I found incident reports from the hospital's final years, multiple discrepancies in body storage logs, several instances of unidentified remains, one investigation in 2007 involving missing autopsy records. The investigation had been closed without resolution. The records were sealed. I checked the date on the toe tag, December 19th. It was now December 17th. 2 days remained. I requested emergency leave from my office. I told them I was unwell. They approved it without question. I stayed home. I avoided travel. I monitored my health obsessively. Heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory function. Everything was normal. December 19th came and went. I was fine. No cardiac event, no incident. I returned to work the following week, but I still have the photographs. I look at them sometimes late at night when I cannot sleep. The toe tag with my name, the morgue log with the entry dated in my future. The refrigeration units running without power. I do not know who filled out that tag. I do not know how my identification number appeared in records from a facility I had never worked at, documenting a death that had not occurred. But I know this. The date on that tag was wrong. I survived December 19th. I am still here. And yet, somewhere in that basement, in that vacant morgue, my name was written in a log that never stops recording, even after the bodies have all been moved, the power has been cut, and the building has been sealed and forgotten.